Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, I'm Hadrintika Putri from English Education Class B. So at this moment, I'd like to review a book of Teaching by Principle. So actually, this is an interactive approach to language teaching that was written by Doris Brown. And in this video, I will discuss the second chapter of this book, only the second chapter, regarding the methodical history of language teaching. So without further ado, let's do the next slide. Alright guys, before we come into the core of our discussion today regarding the methodical history of language teaching, the first and the foremost, I better to give you an overview about these three things or these three keywords about methodical history of language teaching. So what is method or methodology? What are the aspects that attach to it according to expert? So the definition of method or methodical, according to Edward Anthony, definition of this is method is an overall plan for systematic presentation of language based upon a selected approach. And while approach is a set of assumptions dealing with the nature of language, learning, and teaching. And the last but not least, is a technique. So the technique should meet the method and also the approach as well. So the technique were the specific activities played in the classroom that were consistent with the method and therefore were in harmony with an approach as well. So as you can see in the slide, these three keywords are the definition by Edward Anthony. And now we are moving on to the focus of our. Alright guys, now we are coming to the core of our discussion today regarding several types of method in teaching language. But for your information guys, that these methods were applicable in immemorial time. So as our topic today about history of pedagogy, of course we talk about the past and it take place in immemorial time, long time ago. But not to mention that these methods have contributed to give innovation to generation in terms of raising second language acquisition. And all right, now let's talk about this one by one. Okay, the first is the grammar translation method. So since immemorial time, this kind of method was known as a classical method by Western world. But in the 19th century, the classical method come to known as the grammar translation method. So in this case, the student was focused on grammatical rules, vocabulary acquisition by memorizing, text reading, and grammatical analysis. But actually, the concept of this method is no pronunciation or no attention to pronunciation. But actually, the method was proven can successful in leading toward a reading knowledge of second language. All right, now we're moving on to the next method about Gouin and the series method. So, as the name Gouin, so Gouin is the one who successfully found this method. So, his full name was Francois Gouin, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, I don't know how to say the French name exactly, but he's a French teacher of Latin with considerable insight. So he had been through and thin and thick of his life to drive in his sight in his insight. So he just struggled to learn Germany until he arrived at the fail moment. So he has been struggling for his learning about Germany. So he had learned its grammar, thousands of German vocabulary, be man enough to make conversation, but ended up being laughed. But he never come into the satisfactions of his learning. And until at the moment that he thought, uh, how can a child possibly become fluent at their first language? So actually, this method was inspired by his nephew. Very interesting, right? And therefore, he observed children language acquisition and conclude that language learning is primarily a matter of transforming perception into conception, and children are learning this way. So the core of this method actually is about learning like learning language like children. And and the third method is the diet method. So actually this method is similar to previous method, that is going and series method, which focus of the learning second language with natural way, like how children acquire their first language. So the method emphasizes that second language learning should be more like first language. So like lots of oral interaction, make conversation, be spontaneous of using language, no translation, and little focused on grammatical rules or analysis. Okay, now we are moving into the next slide and the next discussion of this. All right, guys, now we are in the last slide of our discussion. Now, let's talk about the lingual method first. So actually, this method was found by a US country, and it combined the correlation between linguistic and psychological theory. So there's some characteristic actually of this method. The first is new material is presented in dialect form. The second is there's depends on mimicry, memorization of said phrase, and overlearning. And the third is there is a little grammar explanation, or grammar is taught by inductive analogy. And the fourth is limited vocabulary and learn it by context. So the vocabulary learning is focused on the context. So, and the fifth is pronunciation is matter. And the last but not least, there's much use of there's much use of tapes, language labs, and visual aids. Okay, now uh, the second method, or the fifth method. So cognitive code learning. So actually, this method using deductive real learning into knowledge classes. So this method learning is combination of the audiolingual and grammar translation technique. So but unfortunately, this method wasn't seen effective, and it was not communicatively proficient learners according to teachers and material developers. So teachers and material developers saw that this method is not effective to increase the communications proficient to learners. So therefore, the innovation doesn't last for the extended time. Okay, the last method is designer method. So this method actually was found or was invented in 1970, and the method was in potentially contributed in our current communicative approach to language teaching. So let's talking about 5 products of the method. So the designer method consists of several approach as well. So the first is community I'm sorry, community language learning. So this approach emphasizes that group or social learning rather than classroom as usual. So students are divided into several groups and the teacher as a facilitator. So apart from this method, students would interact in an interpersonal communication, so the language can be acquired naturally. So the next is uh, about this approach is Suggespedia. So Suggespedia. So among method that I've mentioned before, this one I found unique because Suggespedia method using Baroque or uh in our society it was known as a classical music. Uh so Suggespedia method using classical music in language acquisition. What interesting, right? So the class was set as relaxed and comfortable as possible, and the application of this method, there would be a pause, or there would be a pause, a minute or two, give or take, to listen to classical music before, after, or in the middle of classroom activity. But unfortunately, this method was being critical and questionable by some people. And the next approach is like silent way. So the method actually demands students to be independently discover. So as the name silent, teacher should be passive and students should be active to cooperate to each other in the process of solving language problems. So the next approach is total physical response. So this method involved listening and acting as the core of the method. And the last is a natural approach. So this approach was aimed at the goal of basic communication skills, that is everyday language situation. And this method actually combined silent way and TPR method. TPR method actually uh, is a total physical response method, but the center of this approach is teacher. So teacher as being an input for learning process. Okay, I think that's all from my explanation about the methodical history of language learning. So now we come into the next slide about the questions. So, do you have any questions about this explanation or about my videos? So you can drop your questions below, okay? And I would answer your questions right away. Okay, thank you very much.